The beauty of the house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite. So begins Susanna Clark's incredible book, Piranesi, an opening line which sets the stage not just for the story, but really the philosophical and psychological roller coaster that is about to unfold. The main character of the book, known as Piranesi, lives basically alone in a seemingly infinite house. Imagine a house that is a labyrinth of halls and rooms and vestibules and staircases, and lining the walls and halls of this infinite house are statues on plinths that depict humans, animals, and other representations of a world that we would all recognize. The house is situated on 3 levels. The upper level is the realm of the clouds, which obstruct vision and mobility. The lower level is the realm of the tides, where a sweeping ocean swallows most of the halls. And the middle level is the realm of men and birds. The tides occasionally sweep in to the middle level and flood the halls at various times. Now, Piranesi, again, the main character here, considers himself a bit of a scientist and a bit of an explorer. And like any good scientist, he keeps meticulous records of his findings on statues and the movement of the tides, various things relevant to the house, and his own personal feelings as he's discovering all this stuff and learning about his world. So the story of the book is basically told in this way through Piranesi's journal entries, where the reader only really has access to what Piranesi is thinking and feeling. And again, it's all happening through these journal entries. All right, so hopefully you're following along. We have this main character, Piranesi. He's recording things and talking about his personal feelings as he navigates this strange, infinite house filled with vestibules and statues and tides. So what? Well, simply put, I think that Piranesi is one of the best books, maybe the best book I've ever read, and I can almost guarantee that if you are listening to this podcast right now, if you've made it to minute 3, or really if you've ever enjoyed an episode of this podcast, then you probably are going to like this book. It's relatively short, the type of book that you might be able to read over the course of a few days, maybe even a few hours if you're a quick reader. But it's an absolute psychological mystery thriller of the highest order, and it's jam-packed with philosophical, psychological, and historical ideas. So even if you don't want to listen to me babble on about Piranesi with these chapter-by-chapter episodes, you really should go out and get Piranesi, maybe check it out from your library. It's definitely worth a read, especially if you're someone who tends to enjoy the types of things we talk about on this podcast: philosophy, history, psychology. Piranesi is exciting and fun, and it's a mature story in its own right, and it touches on interesting themes that are favorites of this podcast. Things like memory, identity, loneliness, mental health, relationships, knowledge, truth, the problems of experience, ideals, progress, trauma, abuse, friendship, beauty, evil, nature, meaning, love, reason, self-reflection, colonialism, imperialism, existence versus essence, so on and so on. The list of interesting connections that you could make to this book is perhaps as infinite as the house itself. So I created a little 7-episode series on the book that can be enjoyed over on my Patreon page. So if you're into part 1 here, you can get the rest of it over on the Patreon page at patreon.com/reflectinghistory. You can also just click the link in the show notes for this episode. Now, back to the first chapter of the book, part one, we get the description of the house from Piranesi that I described earlier. And immediately you're a bit struck by the immensity of the house. There is something beautiful about the description of the statues and the halls and the way the tides come in and go out. But there's also an isolation and a sadness that goes along with that. In psychology, it's often called an awe experience. Oftentimes, you can feel this when you experience nature. Many of us may have stood alone on a beach and you're sort of standing there looking out into the beauty of the ocean, but you're also a bit in awe and maybe even intimidated by the scale and the emptiness and the enormity of it. Piranesi gets at this idea in his first journal entry that we read in the book, where he's talking about the feeling of almost getting swept away in one of these tides that comes crashing through one of the halls of the house. He says, quote, "The waters covered me, and for a moment I was surrounded by the strange silence that comes when the sea sweeps over you and drowns its own sounds. I thought that I was going to die, or else that I would be swept away into the unknown halls, far from the rush and thrum of familiar tides. I clung on." End quote. Some interesting foreshadowing there now that I read that again. But anyway, this imagery of the tides and of the sea and that sense of awe and scale is going to be something that's a theme and something that's present throughout the book. In that passage, Piranesi is pointing to the silence of the tides going back out, which connects to another larger theme of the book, which is that of absence and loss. Already, just within the first few pages, we're introduced to this enormous house and Piranesi attempting to gather data and chronicle it all. But he realizes the enormity and the impossibility of that task when he's faced with the infinite nature of the house. And in an infinite world, sometimes the absence or loss of something can be just as important as the presence of something. Piranesi points this out again early on in the book, saying, quote, "No hall, no vestibule, no staircase, no passage is without its statues. In most halls, they cover all of the available space, though here and there you will find an empty plinth, niche, or apse, or even a blank space on a wall otherwise encrusted with statues. These absences are as mysterious in their way as the statues themselves." End quote. I think Susanna Clark is pretty clearly laying a foundation here for some of the major themes of the book that have to do with exploring these absences or places that don't exist, whether they be actual places like the house, missing people, missing identities, confusion after loss and trauma, or any other type of emptiness. In sort of the introductory page preface of the book, Susanna Clark quotes another character who's going to be introduced later in the book and who we will talk about quite a bit later on in this series. His name is Lawrence Arne Sayles. And the quote goes, quote, "People call me a philosopher or a scientist or an anthropologist. I am none of those things. I am an anamnesiologist. I study what has been forgotten. I divine what has disappeared utterly. I work with absences, with silences, with curious gaps between things. I am really more of a magician than anything else." End quote. Again, this theme of absence and mystery is getting a foundation laid for it early on in the book. And that quote there can't help but remind me of the job of the historian as well, which in some ways Piranesi is in this book. Not to get too into spoilers for future chapters, but him trying to uncover his past through his own actions, but also interpretations of what he did in the past, and reading through his journal entries from the past is a huge part of this book. And the job of the historian is sometimes not just to point out what is overt and obvious, but also to give voice to the unheard voices in the historical record, the people, events, and ideas that do not get told in standard narratives of history. As Lawrence Arn Sales said in that quote, sometimes the most interesting things in history are the curious gaps in between things and the absences. Anyways, as the story unfolds, we start to realize that the immense beauty of the house, with its awe and with its absences, is beginning to lead to as much mystery and questioning as anything else. Not all is as it seems, and what on the one hand could be called a beautiful world full of nature and majesty and statues could also be interpreted as a prison, a labyrinth of loneliness designed to lose someone or maybe even drive them crazy. We quickly realize that Piranesi is a bit of an unreliable narrator. His notebooks are at times confusing, even to him. His calendar system doesn't make any sense. Humorously, he doesn't understand what could have happened 2011 years ago that would make him want to label his journal June of 2011. Someone has been ripping pages out of his journal, which is puzzling to Piranesi. Probably most puzzling of all is that Piranesi doesn't even remember his name. He calls himself Piranesi because that's what the other calls him. More on the other later. But as we read it, it becomes increasingly clear to us that Piranesi is losing his memory, and he's having major issues remembering the past. The journals help, but something weird is definitely going on. So as the mystery of Piranesi the person deepens, the mystery of the house deepens as well. Again, it could very easily be interpreted as a prison. The ties are dangerous, as Piranesi points out. Piranesi is all alone. There is something spooky and cavernous about the house. The memory loss is troubling. We soon learn that there are 14 dead skeletons strewn throughout the house in different locations, certainly adding to the ominous tone and the budding mystery. At a certain point here in part one, Piranesi introduces us to the other. The other is described as a scientist like Piranesi who is deeply interested in discovering what he calls the great and secret knowledge that the house must contain. According to Piranesi, quote, "The other believes that there is a great and secret knowledge hidden somewhere in the world that will grant us enormous powers once we have discovered it. What this knowledge consists of, he is not entirely sure, but at various times he has suggested that it might include the following. 1. Vanquishing death and becoming immortal. 2. Learning by a process of telepathy what other people are thinking. 3. Transforming ourselves into eagles and flying through the air. 4. Transforming ourselves into fish and swimming through the tides. 5. Moving objects using only our thoughts. 6. Snuffing out and reigniting the sun and stars. 7. Dominating lesser intellects and bending them to our will." End quote. This revelation that there is a great and secret knowledge to be found adds another layer of depth to the house and a layer of complexity to the working relationship between Piranesi and the other. They meet twice a week to discuss this secret knowledge, and it seems like the other is in control of these meetings from the beginning. It's clear from Piranesi's description of what the other thinks the secret knowledge could be that the other views it all as something that could potentially benefit him, some sort of power that would allow him to dominate or control others. The other is not described as someone who cares much for others, pun intended. Piranesi says that the other never visits the graves of the dead, which seems to indicate that the other really isn't too worried about why they're dead or who they are. And immediately, the reader is wondering if the other had anything to do with these deaths to begin with. On the other hand, Piranesi does visit the graves of the dead to deliver flowers and talk to them, maybe soothing their remains as they go on their next journey. And this really introduces us to Piranesi's spiritual practices in the book, which seem to relate to appreciation and respect for the house and all of its inhabitants. But this process of visiting the dead also showcases Piranesi's character traits. He really is a fascinating and unique character. He is meticulous and detail-oriented, refusing to believe anything that can't be verified with his senses or his logical thought process. He is meticulous in the way he has routines, including the routine of visiting the dead. But these routines are all secondary to the fact that Piranesi is just a kind person. He's a good dude, almost to a fault. He seems to be naive to the nature of his prison and the nature of evil in the world around him. And the naive nature of Piranesi is all rooted in his kindness. He visits the dead not to find some secret knowledge or figure out some mystery, but because he seems to genuinely care about them. He wants them, or whatever is left of them, to be happy and comfortable, because that's just the type of guy Piranesi is. Piranesi as a person finds love and meaning and depth in the house and in the statues of the house and in his interactions in daily life in the house. There's a bit of dramatic irony at play here because by the end of part one, we can probably guess that something fishy is going on and this house may be some sort of prison for Piranesi. But somehow that makes his innate kind nature, his respect and reverence for going about the ordinary tasks of daily life, all the more admirable. Piranesi is a relentless optimist, able to find love and beauty in a cold and bleak and drowned world. He's able to create purpose and meaning for himself through his inner nature. At the end of part one, Piranesi spots a leaf that is floating on the water of one of the rooms of the house and looks quite out of place. And as the mystery unfolds and as things get more sinister, we may realize that much like the leaf that probably belongs in the air, Piranesi, with his kind and decent nature, may be out of place in the world around him. If you liked this episode of the podcast and you want to continue listening to me talk about the mysteries of Piranesi and the mysteries of the house, just a reminder that you can get the rest of this podcast series on my Patreon page, patreon.com/reflectinghistory. You can also click the link in the show notes. So it's all there if you want to listen to more of Piranesi, or if you just want to support the podcast in general. With that said, as always, thanks for listening.